Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and in this video we're going to be talking about Alexander. I figure I'm already so far behind on my content schedule for 5.1 because of all the circumstances I had last week that I might as well go back and work on a video I was really excited to release before 5.1 came out, but it was a long video, so I just never got around to releasing it. This video I want to talk about the history of the Alexander raid, because for a lot of people who were around back then, the upcoming ultimate for Alexander, it has a lot of meaning. It represents a time in Final Fantasy XIV that a lot of newer players might not be familiar with, and I want to share some of that history with you in this video. Before we go any further, big shout out to the Elysium Free Company for allowing me to grab a bunch of their old videos on YouTube and use them for this video. There's probably a few different perspectives in there, so for any perspective I use, I'll include a Twitter and Twitch link in the description of the video if they're still playing Final Fantasy XIV. So Alexander Ultimate, or the Epic of Alexander, is going to be releasing on November 12th. The big thing that made me want to release this video before then is that name, the Epic of Alexander. You know, a long poem about heroic deeds as per a quick Google search to make sure I wasn't misrepresenting it. It really does speak to the way Alexander shaped Final Fantasy XIV as a whole. For those who weren't around, when Heavensward released in the first Alexander raid tier, Goredas released, in my opinion, it almost single-handedly re-destroyed Final Fantasy XIV, sent it back into a place of obscurity. The raid scene was destroyed, the number of activities anyone else could do wasn't very enticing, and there was no sense of progression for anyone who couldn't tackle this incredibly limited scope that Goredas and eventually Midas would eventually, demand of its players. Those who managed to get through Goredas were shaped for the rest of Final Fantasy XIV to be prepared for almost any challenge, whether it be an extremely exciting encounter or an incredibly boring one. Midas further shaped those skills in giving us the mechanical vomit like we'd never seen before, even from the previous expansion and its one tier of savage encounters. And then Creator, which began the era of what you see today, of the development team learning that having people being able to beat your content is usually a pretty good idea, even if it's not necessarily the most cutting-edge level of gameplay that people can come to expect, or had come to expect from the previous raid tier. That's why I want to do this video, so you can really understand why all of this is such a big deal, why people who survived that era really want some revenge on Alexander. So our journey starts with that of Goredas, the first raid tier of Heavensward, and our introduction into the Alexander raid series. Now, the Bahamut raid series was one that was incredibly loved, but it had its feedback of not being too accessible story-wise, despite the incredible amount of effort that went into it, on top of it being technically the finale of the 1.0 story. Not to mention that people also wanted more cutting-edge challenges, which is what led to Second Coil Savage in the first place. So taking all the feedback from A Realm Reborn, Alexander was presented to us with a normal and a savage difficulty. Now, normal is pretty much as you've come to experience Eden today if you're new in Shadowbringers. It's very casual, easy to do in the Duty Finder, maybe a couple wipes here and there because people don't know what they're doing, but certainly not a problem for the majority of the player base. However, this savage tier was on a whole nother level from what the traditional Bahamut raid scene was like prior. Savage was meant to be something that the sub 5%, even in some cases sub 1 or 2%, were going to be capable of completing in its entirety. And what that led to was a raid scene with pretty much nobody except the most hardcore even available or even able to make it past the third boss. And we'll get into those individualities of the bosses when it comes to it. But this sparked the beginning of a big learning process for the development team and one of the darkest eras in the post-relaunch of Final Fantasy XIV. Before even talking about the bosses inside of Goredas, people sometimes couldn't even get in the front door of this raid tier. This is going to precede everything I have to say about this raid tier. There was a doorman in order to actually get into the first boss encounter named Faust. Now, on normal mode, not a big deal. But on Savage, he was basically a, if you can't beat me, you don't deserve to do the rest of this raid tier boss. You needed to have a minimum amount of DPS, and you need to make sure you survive the almost endless feeling wave of dolls that would come at you while you were trying to deal with him. It was just a Zerg fest, but there were people who had to stop here. They couldn't get past it, and they had done previous raid tiers through like Bahamut and stuff. That sets the tone for the things that I'm going to tell you from now on. And there's one of these at the beginning of every raid tier. I'd say the very first Faust is probably the most, I guess, the one that has the highest notoriety, because he's the only one that really stopped people that hard. But it was an intense time. And he's not even a hard boss. It's just a giant DPS dummy that swings back at you. But he is what he is. Now, going into Savage Goredas, the first two encounters are actually not that different from what you'd experience nowadays, and were probably scaled pretty similarly. The first encounter against the Oppressor, pretty straightforward boss. It starts as one boss, teaches you all the mechanics, then a second boss comes out, and you have to defeat them both at the same time. It had proper placement, its tuning wasn't too much, it was the right mix of everything, and I think nowadays would still release as a relatively well-received encounter for a first Savage fight. Then came A2 Savage, which was really fun to progress on, you know, waves and waves of goblins, you had these gob walkers that you had to use, which people didn't really like that, but during the first few weeks, it was pretty fun trying to optimize on using these gob walkers to deal with the various goblins and the waves, while still racing against us in Rage. A little bit tighter on the tuning for the first week or two, probably more so than what you'd see nowadays, but a really fun encounter before you were overgearing it. The big problem and the big thing that people remember from Goredas, though, is Living Liquid, who will actually be the first boss of the Epic of Alexander as per the most recent live letter. He is probably the single most notorious being, if not the second most notorious being, in all of the Alexander raid series. So what was it about Living Liquid? Well, pretty much everything. Tons of mechanical vomit, a super tight DPS check in the first several weeks, and honestly, for those of us who were around for it, a really, really fun encounter. That's an encounter that if it was scaled to today's standards, it may not stand up to the test of time just because of, it'd probably have to be rescaled to be beatable more reasonably. But at the same time, for the era that it was built, those of us who got to experience loved it. You know, we've been dying for another fight that feels like a Living Liquid fight, that so carefully has your tanks and your healers and your DPS demanding all sorts of responsibilities that really feels like everyone's chipping in, and that there's no, broken leg on the side that just you have to kind of drag it through every time you do the encounter. Now, while I say Living Liquid demanded the most out of every role that I think any encounter had up to that point, one thing in particular came out of the Living Liquid era, of the Goredas era, and that was the everybody DPS's mentality that we use today. You know, in A Realm Reborn, it wasn't too uncommon for a tank to drop stance back when it reduced their damage dealt, to deal a little bit more if they could, or for a healer to throw out a couple of cleric stance global cooldowns to deal some damage. Living Liquid and Goredas demanded that your healers and your tanks do everything to get every edge imaginable. Tanks never using their tank stance unless desperate. Your healers doing their best to have as much cleric stance uptime as was feasibly possible in the encounter, while still keeping everyone alive. This was the encounter that shaped players who still play today into what they are. Because anyone who had to play tank or healer in that era remembers the amount of stress, the amount of extra work and learning that went into this encounter and how it would shape the way they raided from that point on. It really is one of the biggest points in Final Fantasy XIV history, and so it being the very first boss of the Epic of Alexander, again, it just fits that whole theme of a long poem of heroic deeds, because that's very much what it felt like, and I don't think even this Ultimate will be able to capture that, but it'll trigger some PTSD at the very least that makes us remember that era, with a little bit of rose-tinted glasses. Now, after Living Liquid, unfortunately, we get to talk to one of the most notorious encounters for the wrong reasons, in that of Manipulator. If Living Liquid was everything a raider would love about an encounter, cutting-edge DPS checks, tight heal checks, everyone being equally responsible, and then some, Manipulator was all of that in the least fun way possible. Not only was it an incredibly gear-gated encounter under most normal raid circumstances, minus a group that went back and did it in China with full I-190 with a very specific composition and having already cleared it on the global servers, it was just not a fun fight. A boss that stayed still the whole time, very unsatisfying autos, tank busters, and not to mention one of the most notorious mechanics that people still meme on today, Judgment Nisi. Now, I'm sure you've heard jokes about Judgment Nisi, whether it be in my content or other people's content, but it was essentially a mechanic that would put a dot on two different players, and it would be two different dots, a Judgment Nisi A and a Judgment Nisi B. Now, that dot would start really strong and get weaker as it went, but if you touched anybody, they would get the dot and it would start at its full 5-stack potency, so they would start taking that massive amount of damage that would then trickle off. On top of the damage over time, if one person ever received both Nisis, that person would instantly be killed, so you had to make sure never to cross paths with the other debuff. So that doesn't sound that bad on the surface, but with Manipulator, they took it to another level, because not only did you need to manage this debuff, it was only cast once the entire encounter, and it was intended that you carry that mechanic throughout the entirety of the rest of the fight, because you needed the Judgment Nisis as a key to unlock a mechanic called Royal Pentacles. These pentacles were, one of two colors, one that would match each of the Nisi debuffs, and you could destroy them by having Judgment Nisi as a debuff and then walking into the pentacle and then taking a bunch of damage. Now, that on its surface, again, doesn't really sound that bad, but without the Nisis, it was intended that you just die, because you just can't deal with the Royal Pentacles. On top of that, the Pentacles were somewhat random. While they were always in the same spot, the number of them that would be a specific color would be different. You could have 5 orange Pentacles and 1 blue one. You could have 3 and 3, or you could go 5 and 1 the other way. And the group needed to be able to respond to that in whatever pattern it actually was, without ever dropping the debuff, without ever touching the other person with it, and without ever spreading it unnecessarily. Not to mention that this damage needed to be managed against tank busters, stack damage markers, damage that can't be overlapped between 2 players, killing adds, and then bringing adds into a central location still without touching each other, and then dealing with another add that's dealing tank damage while more raid damage is coming out. It essentially just made for the most godly healers if they could do this. It required the most perfect of motions, and nobody liked it. The first 8 minutes of that encounter were super boring, and then you got Nisi and you just wanted it all to end. Luckily, a Japanese group, the World Second group, I believe it was Lucrezia, if I'm recalling correctly for the free company name, they revealed that you could actually forego all of that and just, blow up the pentacles using the game's sort of delayed death system, where you only die when the animation deals the damage. And you could have 3 people sack 2 pentacles each and ignore all that. And even though you were taking deaths, losing MP, wasting resources, it was good enough to get you through, and it was far, far easier than executing on all the Nisis. When we think of Ultimate, we know there's going to be Nisi. There's no doubt there's going to be Nisi about it. That being said, we're all dreading what they're going to do with it. Will it be just a short 2 or 3 minute Nisi hold that isn't the entire encounter? Will they go way more insane with it, or will they just do it like they use Nisi in later mechanics? It's a big question, but Manipulator is not a very fun memory for a lot of us who were around for Goredas. And between Manipulator and Living Liquid, these 2 encounters almost destroyed the entire raid scene. We didn't have cross-world party finders back then. If you wanted to raid with a group, you had to character transfer to that server. It caused everyone to exodus to Gilgamesh and abandon the raid scenes on the majority of other servers that weren't tight-knit friends. People who couldn't beat the 3rd encounter just dropped raiding altogether. And those who were left kind of just got bored. It was a really, really bad time, and it was hard to think that the game could recover from such a mistake. On top of that, 3.1, which, unrelated to this video, just wasn't very compelling, again, for either casual or hardcore player bases. So it was just a really rough time, and it's a heck of a way to start this video, because we still haven't even gotten to talk about the other 2 raid tiers yet. Now, the next raid tier was Midas, and this was kind of a turning point for Heavensward. After a not so well received initial raid tier, and 3.1 being kind of a dud, 3.2 started to try to earn back the trust of the players, although I'd say it had mixed success. Now, while other features of 3.2 were very much loved, the Warring Triad was introduced, Final Fantasy classic going back to 6. Midas wasn't much better than Goredas, it was just different. So the first encounter, to this day, is still one of my favorite first encounters in a raid tier. Twinkle Dinks is his name, and I'm really hoping we do see him in Savage, a mad scientist who you had to use different sort of potions to counteract his mechanics. Very mechanically intense and very satisfying for a first encounter. It wasn't scaled to be any more difficult, DPS-wise than the other first encounter of that of the Oppressor. So again, nowadays, this fight would still stand out as like a great first encounter, and to this day, it's been better than any first raid boss in any raid tier I think I've done in Final Fantasy XIV. But then you got to the second encounter, A6 Savage, or the second encounter in Midas. This was a gauntlet of 4 bosses. You would start with, I hope I get the order right, I think it was Blaster, Brawler, Swindler, and Vortexer. 4 different robots you'd have to fight in succession. Now, in normal mode, when you defeated one of these bots, it would actually checkpoint you, and when you continued, you would actually just go to the next bot and continue where you left off. On Savage, you had to run a literal 4-room gauntlet, defeating each boss in sequence before an enrage timer was met. So all 4 of those encounters were part of the same enrage timer. Really cool fight. To this day, I still love it. But if people were disbanding their statics over A3 Savage and Goredas, Unfortunately, this became a spot for Statics who were trying to get back into the raid scene. Now they only got to the second encounter and a lot of those groups disbanded, which didn't do any favors to the Final Fantasy XIV raid scene. It was still the same problems as before thanks to this one. I do want to say we will be seeing a lot of these robots. If you've seen the teaser for Epic of Alexander, these robots do come together to form a Voltron sort of bot, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And yeah, I expect to have to fight all of them individually as well as all combined, which will be a very fun talking point here in a couple minutes. But the first guy, basically you get them all to like 50% or to 0%. And they all do like a super mechanic that's very, I guess, specific to them. The first one, I keep forgetting his name, Blaster. I keep wanting to say Brawler. First one, Blaster would summon clones that you would have to look away from or look towards or even just get out of their path. That was his big thing, was summoning mirages that had all these various effects. He also had these landmines that he would put down that tanks would need to disarm. Brawler, the second boss, had 4 different major attacks. One of them was single drill, double drill, single laser, double laser. Single drill was get far away from him. Double drill was it'll hit the person closest and farthest from him, so you need to have somebody bait that. The single laser was a tank buster, and the double laser was a split with the party damage. Now these guys also had their own individual insta-hit tank busters that gave magic volt up, and so it was pretty fun to manage that. With Brawler in particular, when he dies, he goes to the center of the room and he summons like a bunch of orbs. You gotta have tanks eat these orbs, that they make sure they don't reach the center. DPS need to kill these other orbs. There's chakrams floating around that'll paralyze you and do a ton of damage, and you still need to do single drill, single laser, double laser, and so it was super engaging. Swindler, the big 2 things that came out of that encounter were height and enumeration. Height, basically, there'd be the arena would shift and there'd be 2 different platforms of different heights that you could step between. If you had low arithmetics, you needed to stand on the high platform, and if you had high arithmetics, you needed to stand on the low platform, almost to create like a balance, I suppose. And that gets people. It's one of those like super simple mechanics that requires way more brain power than it should. Meanwhile, enumeration was a stack marker where if you didn't have the exact number of people that were in the orbs floating above the stacked person's head, then people would just take a ton of damage, 99% of the time die back then. Finally, Vortexer had, water tornadoes that needed to be frozen with ice bombs. You had to disarm other water tornadoes with flamethrowers, and the biggest things there were compressed water and a lightning attack that escapes the name, where the lightning attack you needed to have one person pass it to another person by it blowing up onto the other person, and compressed water was, a stack the party damage. And if the same person ever got compressed water or the lightning debuff twice in a row, or twice while they had the proper debuff, then it was over. It was a very carefully orchestrated fight, and in some ways Vortexer almost earns the right to be a fight all in himself. Honestly, all the bots did. But all this stuff that I'm explaining to you now, so I don't have to explain it later, because we have to bring these guys up again a second time pretty soon. Unfortunately, we kind of have to glaze over A7 Savage. A7 Savage is actually against All Thoughts, who is the primary antagonist, and thus could despite it being Alexander's namesake, the entirety of the events are all because of this character, All Thoughts. So he is the main villain, and he's like the 7th encounter out of 12. And it was a fun fight. It has a lot of very unique things that still stand out to this day. A lot of targeted damage on specific non-tank party members, ads you need to deal with. 4 different jails where, it drops off like a healer in this one or a tank in this one. And there's a mechanic that's specific to each job in each of them. So all of that holds to be pretty important when it comes to managing everything. And it was a super long encounter, like over 12 minutes long if I recall. I just soloed it like before making this video and I don't even remember. It was just so long. There were giant balls that would roll around and crush people. There was a cat that would summon hearts that if they reached the boss you were just gonna wipe. And even more interestingly, if anyone disconnected from the game during that encounter, the boss had like an anti-disconnect mechanic where if somebody died, the boss got damage stacks, but if they disconnected, they got damage stacks too, because it would, I guess, register as a death. So you just couldn't disconnect even, and there were some pretty bad issues when it came out with people disconnecting. Not to mention, I didn't even mention A6 Savage had bugs that sometimes forced the compressed water and the lightning debuff to kill you instantly. All sorts of weird things happened in Midas. There's the joke that says Midas had no bugs, and it had a few bugs. This is to say it had a few bugs. But after All Thoughts, as much as that is, I will say All Thoughts, while it was no A3 Savage, really, really good encounter. It does not get as much credit as it deserves. I really like it to this day. A8 Savage was another, was basically, if this had been the last boss after Living Liquid the first time, people would have really remembered Goredas far more fondly than they did. Brute Justice was the first boss on Slaughter, which looks like a mini Manipulator. It even has the metal theme, the same theme that plays during Manipulator, and it kind of does some Manipulator-like mechanics. You know, it uses Nises and Pentacles, and you have to destroy them, and there's dots ticking, but it doesn't work anything like Manipulator. It was almost like they were making fun of their first failed attempt at a boss like this. He dies really quick, and then the 4 robots come one by one onto the arena, and you have to do heights and enumerations and lightning passes, and Blaster has a mirage that he summons and needs to be separated. There's single drills, double drills. All 4 of those bots from A6 Savage return here in what is, in my opinion, the most successful I guess, council-style encounter they've ever had in Final Fantasy XIV. I'd say Brute Justice altogether counts as one, but this is really like a council-style phase, and we should expect to see something like this in the Epic of Alexander. But that's not the big thing. In the trailer, when we saw for 3.2, all these bots in the Onslaughter come together to form Brute Justice in a very Super Sentai-style, you know, remix of the metal theme and the Locust theme, and it's still one of the most beloved entries and encounters, even on the normal difficulty here. And he was no messing around. A lot of people refer to Brute Justice, that encounter, as our first ever ultimate. It was that intense, that mechanically and, you know, just grating of an encounter. And it didn't help the raid scene at all. For those of us, again, who did get to do it when it was relevant, it's a wonderful memory and something I still cherish to this day because it is a masterfully made encounter. I've just never seen anything like it. But it didn't help the raid scene recover. You know, the damage done by 3.0, Midas didn't do anything. So as much as they had kind of earned back the trust and love and enjoyment of making a raid tier that was fun from beginning to end, they also still didn't solve the problem of raiders needing to exodus themselves to Gilgamesh in order to do anything endgame unless they had a very set, you know, group of friends. It's just this problem that just kept occurring raid tier after raid tier here. And it needed to be fixed, which is where we come to the finale of our epic, The Creator. That name, The Creator, it really does symbolize what it did because it literally was the beginning of the kind of raid scene that we have now, you know, for normal and savage. It was a normal raid tier that was just like the previous ones, like Gordius Midas. It was something that anyone could consume, but wasn't really like something you would make a static for. But the savage raid tier this time, players could reasonably group up with random people, they could group up with statics of their friends, and complete it, thus largely reinvigorating the raid scene and bringing us to the thriving raid scene that we have nowadays, where you see more like 10, 15, 20% of servers actually getting clears across the entire raid tier. Something that was much healthier for the game and was needed for the less hardcore players to make it feel like there was still another step they could take to improve themselves and their character in the game. It was also the beginning of one of the most important raid changes. Now, I did do a video talking about the history of raiding, and in that video, one of the most important points is Creator, because it was the first raid tier where upon failing an encounter, your cooldowns would reset. Yeah, in Gordius and Midas, not to mention, did all those things that I already said about those raid tiers. If you died, you had to wait for your cooldowns to come back. If you use Hallowed 30 seconds into an encounter, and then someone screwed up and you had to wipe, you were waiting 6.5 minutes for Hallowed. Most people had to come up with, like most tanks I should say, had to come up with alternate openers for their cooldown rotations. Even DPS sometimes had to do it just so you could do another, you know, pull for progression's sake. Or if you were going for a kill, you just had to wait because it was the best thing to do. It was awful. And 3.4 fixed that. Now, whenever you wiped, you got all your cooldowns back. I'll say that is pretty much probably the main reason, on top of item level scaling, which Creator also dumbed down, so you didn't need like this massive amount of gear or this overwhelming skill to bypass it. You didn't need that for Creator, but on top of that, if all of our raid tiers nowadays, all of our EX primals, all of our everything, if we still didn't have cooldown resets, I think our raid scene would be longer just for the sake of being longer right now. It wouldn't be much more satisfying, but it would just be longer. That's it. That's if you want longer raid scenes, good, then get rid of that again. But I don't want to get rid of that because it was terrible waiting in between all those pulls. As for the actual bosses in Creator, I'd say for the most part they've aged well. The first one really didn't, though. The Faust of this one, Faust C, at this point people are kind of over the whole Faust thing. You know, it's supposed to be the final Faust, but it was no one cared by this point. The boss of the first part of Creator, also the Refurbisher, kind of suffered from the same problem as Manipulator, where it's like a boss it's stationary and it's just not as exciting. I do think that Refurbisher, when he was, you know, freshly progressed, actually had some really neat mechanics. He had like platforms that would lower into lava, and you needed to drop bots in the lava at certain times, and you had to use like a mini, an alarm that would die and put a mini puddle down to shrink yourself so you could duck under one of his attacks. It was a lot of really cool things, but he just wasn't well received. I'm actually really curious to see if they can change people's opinions on him. It might also be because people eventually zerged him down for Anima Weapon, a certain part of the Anima Weapon, which was the Relic / Zodiac equivalent of 3.x. Maybe that's why I kind of remember people not really digging him too much. But yeah, the whole stationary thing, I think, is kind of played out its welcome when it's not done super well. I think they've gotten better at it, but they were not very good at it at this point. The second boss I still love to this day, Lame Bricks. If you've done Eureka Pyros, or if you've done the Hidden Gorge PvP mode, you've seen him, and his lore is that he's very good at running away, so we're likely to see him here, and likely to see him again at some point in the future. This was a really cool encounter, this long rectangle of an arena, 3 buttons on it, each had a different effect. You sometimes had to manually trigger these effects, and then you sometimes had to just watch what he was doing with them. He dropped AoEs next to the buttons, away from the buttons. He had a distance-based tank buster. He had a 3-hit tank buster, an instant one, a non-instant one. He was a great encounter. Stack markers, get under the boss, get away from the boss, spread out. Needles, a steamroller where you have to drop fire puddles, deal with knockbacks. It was really fun, and I hope he makes some sort of appearance in the Epic of Alexander, because I think he's earned it. He's a really good second boss for raid tier. But like most raid tiers, Creator was defined by its third and fourth encounter. The third encounter was Cruise Chaser. Now, anyone who's played Final Fantasy IX knows that's Arc, but Cruise Chaser Blasty was the media that inspired Arc, and thus they decided to call him that here. This is a fun encounter, but I'm having a hard time figuring out how I want to describe it, because it was really a mishmash of a lot of things. It had charge mechanics with numbered markers over the heads. It had, you know, circle AoEs you had to bait. It had get to the center of the room. It had rotating AoEs. It had get to the outer side of the room. It had ads to deal with that were just giant purple lapis lazulis, another reference to Arc and Final Fantasy IX. It just had all sorts of things, and put together was fun. And I think that this was kind of what captured me from what was possible with this kind of raid tier. You didn't necessarily have to have something that pushed you to the very edge of your gameplay for it to be fun. And for me, Cruise Chaser and to some extent Lame Bricks really exemplify that. And so if you haven't seen the Cruise Chaser encounter, because I'm having such a hard time really describing what made it so special, other than the song forward and back and then forward. Oh, that song. Yeah, that's going to be great hearing that again when Epic of Alexander comes out. I'd recommend going and watching it when it was new. Go watch like a world first clip of it or something like that. It is a truly wonderful encounter to watch. It is a truly wonderful encounter to experience. Minus the whole active time event thing, which I think this was the first time they ever did that. And left a little bit to be desired. Let's just say that. Finally, we come to the finale of the Alexander raid series, the climax of the epic, and that of Alexander Prime himself. This encounter has definitely held a very special place in a lot of people's hearts, because while it wasn't a cutting-edge A3 Savage, while it wasn't a grittingly boring manipulator, it was just another good encounter. It had a lot of very unique things going for it. It had incredible lore implications from a specific phase, which, if you haven't done the encounter, I'd implore you, enjoy it for yourself the first time you see it. It was just an encounter done right, for the most part. It had some mechanical vomit like you saw in Brute Justice, but not to an overwhelming amount. You would see that in the Temporal Stasis, both 1 and 2, and you would eventually see it later with Inception, which I know you're thinking in your head, "Bong." Honestly, it kind of feels like that sound effect made manifest. It just, knowing that you have to plan a mechanic in advance, and the mechanic's completely invisible to you unless you've done it correctly. There's just these wonderful implications to all the things that Alexander did, and things everyone wants to see in the Epic of Alexander. People want to see time freezes. People want to be sent back in time via the time gates. People want to have to deal with these invisible crystal marker, or these crystal markers that reveal an invisible Alexander, while having tethers and debuffs and all sorts of crazy things going on. This, again, exemplified what encounters could be without necessarily having to push people to the cutting edge of DPS. The final phase was super chaotic as well. You know, you had to drop puddles all over the place. There were tank busters, there were room wides, there was all sorts of things to manage in that final part of the encounter, which comes to our final sort of thought on all of Creator. Creator created an issue, no pun intended, in that once you were overgeared, you skipped the vast majority of encounters. You know, speed killing had already been a thing for quite some time at this point. It's not as popular now as it was back then, but people were like figuring out ways to just outright skip entire phases of encounters. You know, Cruise Chaser, people would skip the Lapis Lazuli ad phase, or they'd skip the GA100 in the first phase, or skip the laser shield mechanic that's supposed to pop up. Just so many mechanical skips that, you know, as much as the encounter as a whole was great, you couldn't help but miss these things when you just didn't get to experience them anymore. Alexander, the entire final phase, most groups started skipping that eventually, or at least coming close to skipping it and doing maybe like a small portion of it. These speed kill groups would never even see it begin to cast. They would kill the boss before the second cast of Inception, which is still several minutes out from the Hardened Rage. So that was the only really big drawback from Creator, and we again still see that to this day, where you encounter phases and portions of phases far less, you know, skipping Black Smokers on Leviathan, or skipping all of the trios on Voidwalker. Yeah, that's been a problem that has actually been recurring since Creator, and at times they've come up with ways to counteract it, but most of the time that's just the way it is nowadays. And it's the only drawback I found to these low DPS check encounters after the first or second week. But that being said, Creator did its job. You know, among other systematic changes in Final Fantasy XIV that were coming or had already been there, the cross-world party finder, you know, all the things we have nowadays with fellowships and cross-world link shells, the cooldowns being reset, the amount of quality of life that Creator began an era of has made it so people from all places and people with all sorts of interests can look at Final Fantasy XIV and think, yeah, why not? I could give it a shot. People who are afraid of savages stepping foot in them for the first time. So many people I know who were afraid, they were scarred from Gordius Midas, stepped into Creator and said, I can do this. I can play. This is fun. I really enjoy this. I'd like to do more. I'd like to challenge myself more. Those people joined then, did it, got into ultimate tiers, and now look at them. It's actually incredible that while Creator was, everyone like in my circles, or even myself, probably like, oh, it's too easy, it saved Final Fantasy XIV's rating, and it probably saved Final Fantasy XIV in the long run, as much as we hate to admit it at times. So what does this all mean for the Epic of Alexander, for Alexander Ultimate? They said they're using everything. We've already seen Living Liquid, we've seen Brute Justice, we've seen Cruise Chaser, we've seen Alexander Prime. And to think that all these other things that I've represented here, all the pain, all of the problems, all of the successes, they'll all be there. Minus the fact they probably won't make us, you know, wait on our cooldowns again. But it's bound to be an extravaganza. And yes, it's the third Ultimate, so yeah, maybe some people think we know what to expect. We know what's going to happen, but the period of time it represents in Final Fantasy XIV can't help but pique our curiosities, you know? The Unending Coil of Bahamut so perfectly represented the rebirth of Final Fantasy XIV and the story that it finished. You know, the what's it called? The Weapons Refrain, or Ultima Weapon Ultimate, you know, brought us back to that special time where a game that had been on the verge of doom had just been saved. And we had gotten to kind of do that journey together for the first time. This is an amalgamation of pain and prosper when it comes to Alexander, and it's hard to find the words for it. All I know is it's going to be something special like the other two Ultimates were, and it's going to mean a lot for those of us who are around for those more dark days of Final Fantasy XIV. And with that, I feel I've given you my Epic of Alexander in some way, shape, or form, and hopefully if you're newer to Final Fantasy XIV, you understand the dark times that it went through, how it recovered from that, and what it means to the people who were around back then. Expect to see all sorts of things popping up. Pepsi Man, Protein Waves, Nisi, Gavel, Communion, all sorts of these terms. And know that they all came from a place where we look back either with a very, very deep sense of ire or very joyous memories. But thank you for listening to my story on the Epic of Alexander, on what it meant back in Heaven's Word. Be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share. And stay tuned. I'll be posting all sorts of clips from Alexander Ultimate as I progress through it live over on Twitch. Thank you for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. And until then, take care.